Hello everyone, welcome to course International Organization and Global Governance, Chapter 5, United Nations and Global Governance. At the end of this video and at the end of this chapter, you will be able to explain the origins and the emergence of the UN. You can recount the UN's principal organs and their functions. You can characterize the basic principles and main purposes of the UN. You can discuss how the UN contributes to global governance. You can assess both the weaknesses of the UN and reform proposals. This chapter includes 5 main titles. The first title is the origins and the emergence of the UN. The second is the United Nations systems, principal organs and their functions. The third, basic principles and main purpose of the UN. The fourth is the role of the UN in global governance, and the final main title discusses the weaknesses of the UN and reform proposals. So let's start with the origins and emergence of the UN. There were 5 key events that played important influence or roles in the creation of the United Nations. In other words, these 5 key events set some sort of precedents for the establishment of the United Nations. The first one is the European traditions and experiences in international law and organization since the 16th century, since the beginning of the modern international system. And also, we know that the Concert of Europe after the Congress of Vienna in 1815 also created some sort of traditions and rules which paved the way for the creation of a universal organizations. The Hague conferences are the third important key events that played important that contributed to the idea of creating an international organization. Also, there were some international public unions of 19th century regarding the international trade and international communication and transportation. They set some sort of examples, early examples of international institutionalization and international organization, which highly contributed to the creation of the United Nations after the Second World War. And also, of course, the League of Nations, which was the first permanent international organization for the maintenance of international peace and security, greatly contributed to the creation of United Nations in terms of both weaknesses and successes. So this is important. What were the steps towards establishing the United Nations? The first one was the Atlantic Charter in August 1941. As you see, the activities, the initiative creating United Nations started quite early during the Second World War. This Atlantic Charter was declared by US President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and of course it included some sort of principles for the post-war war, including the creation of a general association or general organization. So this was the first document, inter-allied document, that made a reference to the creation of the United Nations, or the creation of an international organization similar to League of Nations. And then in January 1942, 26 states declared or accepted, announced the Declaration of the United Nations. For the first time, the term of United Nations was included in an official document, and also 26 states accepted the principles in the Atlantic Charter and also committed themselves to the creation of a new international organizations. And in 1944, in Washington, D.C., in United States, the representatives from the major powers got together and discussed the draft of the Convention of the United or the future United Nations at Dumbarton Oaks conversations. And finally, at the Yalta Conference, towards the end of the war, again, Russia, Soviet Union, United Nations, United States, and Britain committed themselves to the creation of the United Nations. And finally, in 1945, at the San Francisco Conference, the Covenant of the United Nations were adopted, by 50 states, and also Poland was accepted as the original member, and then after that 41 states became the original members, founding members of the United Nations, and United Nations came into being in 1945. So let's look at the principal organs and their functions. One of the United Nations, first of all, has 6 principal organs. The first one is the General Assembly. This was the main deliberative body which included all member states. So all member states are represented at the General Assembly, and all member states are equally represented. Each state has only one vote. This is important. So it is based on the equality of nation states, and it fulfills important functions such as it makes some sort of non-binding recommendations regarding various of issues. It's a kind of a central coordinating body. It oversees the budget of the UN. If states agree to make some sort of revisions to the UN Charter, the General Assembly is the main platform to do that, and also it has a normative influence, and we know that it has some sort of elective responsibilities regarding the different or other UN principal organs. The second principal organ of the United Nations is the Security Council. Security Council mainly responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security. In fact, it has more power than the General Assembly, to be honest. It has authority to take some sort of measures against the aggressors, including economic sanctions or diplomatic sanctions, and most importantly, including the use of force. So the UN Security Council can authorize the use of force. Apart from that, there is no international authority which can give a legal mandate for the use of force in the world. So this is important. And also the UN Security Council is not based on the equality of states, because there are some permanent members, namely United Nations, Britain, China, France, and Russia. And these 5 permanent members have a veto right, so they can veto any decision. Each of these states can veto any resolution. If they veto a resolution, that resolution cannot be accepted. So they are so powerful. And also there are 10 non-permanent members of the Security Council. They are elected by the General Assembly on the basis of geographical allocation. The Secretariat is also another principal organ of the United Nations. It includes the Secretary General and the staff, the civil servants, and they are responsible for the administrative affairs of the United Nations. In fact, Secretary General represents the United Nations, and she is the chief administrative officer of the UN. Another principal organ is the International Court of Justice. International Court of Justice is the judiciary arm of the United Nations. They settle issues through legal action. It includes 15 judges co-elected by the General Assembly and National Security Council. 2 main functions are performed by the International Court of Justice. The first one is the settling the legal disputes, and the second one is giving advisory opinions regarding different legal issues, but there is no compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. Another principal organ of the United Nations is the Economic and Social Council. Economic and Social Council is responsible for international economic and social problems. It aims to promote the welfare of individuals. It aims to find solutions to global economic, social, and health problems. It supports human rights. And we know that it includes lots of agencies within the United Nations, such as UNDP, UNICEF, and other agencies that you can come across while in your daily life. And there is the final principal organ, which is called Trusteeship Council. Trusteeship Council still exists officially, but it is no longer an active UN body because it was established to oversee the administration of the trust territories. So the last trust territory gained independence in 90s. So since then, Trusteeship Council is not functioning. So let's look at the basic principles and main purposes of the UN. So what are the basic principles or the basic purposes of the United Nations? First of all, the main aim of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security. So this is the universal organization which was established in order to oversee, in order to protect international peace and security. The second function, the second purpose defined in the UN Charter is to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. The other one, they encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, and religion. And there's another main purpose of the United Nations is to be center of harmonizing actions of nations. And also we should mention about some principles. For instance, the United Nations, the first principle of the United Nations is the sovereign equality of states. So all member states are sovereign equals. So this is important. And also there is another principle which is called the prohibition of the threat and the use of force. So within the UN system, states without any legal authorization cannot use force, military force, I mean. And also there's another principle which is called the peaceful settlement of international disputes. This is also a UN principle. There is an exception to the prohibition of the use of force, which is called the right of self-defense. If a country is attacked militarily by another country, by an aggressor, that country has a right, collective and individual right to protect itself. So it is called the right of self-defense. And also the final principle of the UN system is the non-interference of international affairs. And of course, this principle has an exception as well, which is called humanitarian intervention. So finally, how UN contributes to global governance, we can divide it into 4 sections. For instance, in international peace and security, in international law and justice, in human rights, and in development assistance. In international peace and security, the first, probably the first contribution of the UN is the pacific settlement of international disputes through mediation, good offices, and through various of tools. And also UN innovated a concept in 50s, which is called peacekeeping. It means that the peacekeeping is the deployment of military force in conflicting regions. So this is an important development. And peace building after the end of the Cold War became a significant tool in order to solve intrastate conflicts within states. So this is important. And the peace enforcement, also another concept related to this subject, which means coercive means in order to enforce peace. So it includes use of force. In terms of international law and justice, we know that United Nations greatly contributes to the development of international law by codifying the different rules, creating new norms, and facilitating the international agreements. And also it provides states with an opportunity to settle their dispute through judicial means, which is called the International Court of Justice. And also we know that United Nations performs important roles in the promotion of rule of law and justice in post-conflict situations, which is called transitional justice. In terms of human rights, first function probably can be considered as the norm creation. So the UN created significant human rights norms and treaties. For instance, 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a significant step in the creation of human rights regime. And also institutionalization of human rights can be considered another contribution. There were some sort of organizations within the UN which are responsible for human rights. This is monitoring for the human rights and reporting human rights abuses. This is important. And the final contribution is generally made in the field of development assistance through operational activities and also through setting some sort of development goals and development agenda. In this regard, the UN Development Program is a significant agency within the UN. So what are the weaknesses of the UN? What are the reform calls? There are some critics leveraged against the General Assembly. The first one is that it has no coercive or binding authority, and also some people argue that it is agenda items and decisions lack focus, and also the UN Security Council is criticized as well. First of all, it's criticized that it privileges the 5 permanent members and so fails to represent the changing nature of the international system, because these 5 permanent members were major states at the end of the Second World War. But there are new countries, emerging powers, new powerful states that are not represented at the UN Security Council. And also UN Security Council is considered as an undemocratic body because of the veto right of these 5 members. And it is also said that it does not represent the majority of UN members fairly. It also fails in terms of geographic representation of the vote. What are the reform proposals? Some proposals argue that the geographical representation should be enhanced and its legitimacy should be strengthened. And also there are some proposals in order to solve the poor coordination among its bodies, agencies of the United Nations, to solve personal issues and limited resources. And also there are some suggestions to get rid of the lack of transparency and accountability. So in this chapter, we have seen the origins and emergence of the UN. We have seen the United Nations system, its principal organs and its functions. We also discussed basic principles and the main purposes of the UN. And we also consider how United Nations contributed to global governance in international peace and security, in human rights, in international law, and in development. And also we consider the weaknesses of the UN organization, and also we discuss reform proposals. Thank you very much for joining me.